Hello, storytellers. Welcome to Bound by Words. My name is Madie. I am a full-time editor and a fantasy writer, and today we are going to be talking about 5 mistakes writers often make with developmental editing. I would like to preface this by saying there is no right or wrong way to edit almost at any stage. I think it's whenever you get close to publication, like the copy editing is really when it starts to get technical. Up until that point, I think it's a lot of trial and error where you should be talking to other writers, you should be experimenting, you should be doing some research, whether it's through YouTube videos or the internet or books, however you consume knowledge the best. But you really need to learn how to identify what your story needs. That's the key point in developmental editing, is to learn what your story needs, and every story is going to need something different. So you're going to have methods that work really well for you, you're going to have methods you really hate, and ultimately, as long as you have a better story in the end, it was definitely useful. But across the board, pretty generally, I see these 5 mistakes pretty often. And the first is not changing enough. And I feel like I could talk about this until I'm blue in the face. I see a lot of writers not changing enough in the developmental editing stage. Even if you have a beautiful outline that you have already developmentally edited, even if you write very close to the outline the entire time you're drafting, which is kind of unheard of in the first place, but even if you do manage that, it is always worth putting in some extra effort to make sure your story could not be improved before you go through all of those stages of editing. There's so much editing that goes into a book, there's so much work that goes into a book, that it seems kind of silly not to build yourself a really strong foundation. So whenever you're done writing, no matter what, make sure you are looking at it through a developmentally editing lens, but also make sure you're making the bigger changes. Those bigger changes can sometimes be a little bit brutal, especially if you're really proud of your story, especially if you're really excited about just being done and sort of where it has gone. It could be hard to kill characters or cut characters out or remove scenes that you're particularly attached to, but every time you do that kind of a change, you can always change it back. You can always save a draft that is the original, and I actually very highly recommend doing that. Save an original, make a copy, do your developmental editing there. That way you can go backwards. So it's no harm, no foul. The only thing you miss out on is learning whether or not you could have told a better story with those big changes. If your story has any weaknesses in the plot or potential plot holes or issues, it's better to find that stuff early on and in the developmental editing stage rather than get really far in the process and find it, or even find it after publishing, hearing your readers talk about it. So we have to make sure we're making those big, necessary, sometimes uncomfortable changes to our manuscript. Don't just change the main character's hair. Don't just switch one location to another, restructure things. Take things in and out of the plot, experiment with like what would happen if the things that took place in chapter 1 now take place in chapter 10? What would happen if you cut out chapters 14 and 15 entirely and sort of left a little bit up to the imagination? You want to make some of those bigger changes, even if it's just for fun, to see if it tells a better story. Mistake number 2 that I often see writers do is not letting the changes they do make affect a larger part of the story. Sometimes we make changes where it really just affects that one little thing. The type of food they're eating is different, the type of conversation they have might be a little bit different. Maybe 2 people have a conversation and you decide that 2 different people need to be having that conversation. Those things could be smaller changes that only affect the scene, but there are going to be some changes, and some changes like that might even need to affect the larger story. If you decide that a character you originally wrote as young and spunky would make more sense if they were old and wise, you really have to go through the story in every instance that character appears and make sure that they are holding themselves and having the attitude and the body language of an old wise man instead of a young spunky teen. You have to make those changes all throughout the story. If you have 2 people who are having a conversation and you change the who is having that conversation, then how does that affect the tension and suspense and dynamic between groups of characters or relationships in general? So if you're making developmental editing changes, there might be some things that are little tweaks here and there, but there are some things that you're going to need to really sew into your story. Whether you're adding foreshadowing or detail, if you're just throwing things in or just making those smaller section changes, then they're going to stand out as not being flush with your world. Sometimes you can even tell if a writer makes a change and doesn't do the due diligence of sewing it into the rest rest of the story or blending it out. With some of the bigger moments, I feel like if you just were to drop something into the story and not make sure it's consistent all the way through, it might even just get forgotten by the reader. So you don't want to do that definitely with important details or anything like that. Mistake number 3 that I see writers make all the time when it comes to developmental editing is focusing only on the plot. When we think developmental editing, we think like, what is the sequence of things happening and how can we improve it? How can we shift things around? What can we take in and out? How do we make this a better story? And I think that's an overgeneralization, even though it is definitely true. A lot of people focus on the plot there. But when it comes to developmentally editing, there is a lot more to develop in a story than the plot. You know, we do a lot more planning and thinking and comparing and analyzing when it comes to telling these stories, whether it is the setting you use, the language you use, the religion you use, the culture, the character arcs, the relationships between characters. We generally think of when developmental editing, or I think we talk about most often, is looking at it like the big plot and then, you know, looking at the acts or the chapters or the scenes and really evaluating like the story segments as a whole, when in reality your story should be like a layer of plot, a layer of character development over here, a little bit of like side plot here, you know, a little bit of relationship tension here. They're not so easily segmentable items, really. So when you look at developmental editing, instead of just looking at the plot, instead of just looking at where your chapters fall and where you can add and subtract scenes, I think it's also really important to look at the progression of our characters when it comes to like their character arc and progression alone, when it comes to their relationships with other characters. I think those are equally as important. You know, reevaluating the settings where characters are moving from place to place could be a really story-changing aspect of developmental editing. Mistake number 4 that I see a lot with developmental editing is to continuously add information but not delete information. Whether you are adding detail or you're adding scenes or you're adding subplots, we always think about, you know, what could make this story better. So sometimes we think about adding things, but very often taking something away can do just as good of a job, if not a better one. You want to tell a concise story that doesn't have any unnecessary information while still being emotionally impactful and gripping for your readers. That is a tough balance to strike, but you know, if we see an area where we're lacking tension, we think, okay, we need to add tension here. This is a weak spot. We need to create a heightened sense of emergency, but just as easily you could delete that whole section. If that section is not serving a purpose for your story, if it is not providing tension, if you could take the little bit of value that section is giving to your story and sew it in somewhere else and have some other scene or character doing 2 things at once, which is always better, then that might be better for your story than just adding tension or just adding plot points or anything else, really. So we talk a lot about like adding language, we talk about adding characters, and I just think everyone, including myself, because I'm definitely an overwriter, especially if you're an overwriter like me, everyone needs to think, is this necessary or could I delete it whenever they are developmental editing? And you know, very often you're going to say, I can't delete this because of this reason. And if you're overwriting and you know you need to slim down words, or if you know something needs deleted but you can't pick what, maybe make a list of reasons why like something deserves to stay, why it shouldn't be deleted, why it contributes to the story. We actually see this pretty often when we're talking about scene cards. A lot of people ask the question like, what is happening here and why it is impactful to the story. And we emphasize whenever we're doing these scene cards that why is so important. And when we're developmentally editing, we're basically taking a full story and breaking it down into scene cards and character cards in smaller segments that we can really move around and digest and alter better. So let's start asking that, why does this deserve to stay for everything in our story? Mistake number 5 that I see a lot with developmental editing, and this one isn't quite so big, but I definitely think it deserves to be mentioned, is using the same developmental editing strategy for every story you write. Now, you as a writer are going to have things that work really well for you, and you're going to have things that don't work as well for you, but each writer will also have something that each story separately will need. If you are editing 2 stories the same, and one is really strong when it comes to character voice, but has really weak plot, and the other one has a really strong plot, but really needs development with the characters, it's not gonna be easy to edit those the same way. You're not going to have to make the same types of changes. So I think a better way to look at learning how to developmentally edit is to learn how to identify what a story needs, and also learn how to separate sort of like what you need to change from what can stay. Learn how to think about that difference and learn how to pull apart parts of your story to analyze them over learning a strict method. We have a lot of methods that we talk about when it comes to novel writing in general, when it comes to planning and drafting and habits. When we do all of these challenges, we have everyone sharing their method, and I think that's great. I think that you should always consume those because you might learn something incredibly useful. But I think developmental editing is something that you have to stay kind of open to. The method of how you go about doing it is going to be a lot different than the individual checklist of sort of what gets done. It's sort of like how if you write a schedule for yourself or a routine for writing and you're like, I'm going to write every day from 3 to 4, just as an example, that just sort of tells you what you're doing. It doesn't tell you sort of what you're writing or what you're working on or what part of the book you're at. It just gives you the structure of this is how I'm going to go about it. I'm going to spend this much time every day working on my book. Developmental editing should be something very similar to that, where you say, this is how I'm going to go about finding the weaknesses in my story, and this is how I'm going to go about looking for ways to improve my story. And then while you do that, you have to be open to experimenting with the things that will help enhance your story, if that makes sense. Like I said at the beginning of the video, and I will say again now, there is no right or wrong way to developmentally edit. These are just 5 things that I think people do often that I think everyone should just be aware of and be conscious of. So if you got any value from this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up and please consider subscribing. I'll see you guys next time.